Hey, you are now listening to the Graceway Podcast. Let's talk with special guest host Jeff Adams.
Hey everybody, Jeff Adams here, and I am with Pastor Tim Dunn, who just finished the second installment of this amazing series on the book of 1 John, and we're going to talk, and so join us, huh? Pastor Tim, I am loving this series on 1 John, and I got to ask you a question, sure. and this is horrible. It's like one theological geek to another,
right.
And so maybe it's a horrible question to start with when other people supposedly are listening in, but I really don't care. and I do think that it's somewhat interesting. Here's my question, okay? What was so amazing to me when you kind of gave us this overview of the book last week is you're not seeing 1 John as the epistle of love and gooiness and all that type of stuff. And John is the apostle of love, and you laid that out. But what you said that was so impressive to me, you said, look, John's dealing with 4 heresies. Yeah. He's the last remaining apostle. Yeah. And rather than doctrinally lay out, here's why I disagree with you, here's what you need to do to get straightened out, he goes back to the basics and said, look, this is what's important. Focus here, and even though we disagree about some things, it's no big deal. Now here's my question, okay? And keep in mind, I had probably taught through the book of 1 John a couple of times before you were born. So I've read a lot of books and commentaries on 1 John, and like I say, people understand he was battling some heresies. But this slant that you had, did you find that in a book or books or maybe a night vision? Where did that come from?
Yeah, so, part of my process is I will read through the book. I honestly might have gotten this from you or someone that you were referencing. I'll read through it 50 times before I look at anything.
I'd be thrilled if you thought that you got it from me, but right. I'm not sure that's true.
Yeah, fair enough. All right. So I read, and then started to do my own work, and then I'll read probably 15 or 20 books around it. And as I was reading through that, I think that probably what was in my mind is I agree that all those things are true, but I really try to process kind of authorial intent, right? So I learned from you way back in the day, the first rule of Bible study is context, context, context. And obviously I think that that's true. I also think that the intent of the author, this was a real person writing a real letter to a real group of people facing real circumstance. And I really found commonality with the controversy piece that John was facing because of COVID and politics and all those kind of things. And I felt like God kind of used 1 John to instruct me around my own posture and temperament during some of the things that happened in COVID, correct me on some things. But I just was so impressed with knowing how personal this was to him, knowing how much controversy he was facing, and watching the discipline and the grace, not the lack of truth, right? But he just is a genius in his packaging of how he was expressing these things. And I think that I had been, during COVID, a little bit at a loss for how to really get at hard issues that I felt like our church and the church was grappling with. And
we were going through racial and political divide at the time.
Yeah,
in addition to COVID.
In addition to. Yeah. And, throw on top of that masks and vaccines and all that. There just was a high level of intensity. And I think that I just started to read against my own backdrop, find commonality with John just as a local church pastor trying to get his people back to Jesus in a way that was helpful to them. And I was really astounded that everything that I read, A, didn't talk about that, but B, did talk about fellowship, unity, love, all those kind of things. And just as I kind of meditated on it, just connecting the brilliance of those two realities, right? His context and his temperament. And I just thought, what a helpful thing to pastors, to me, during the season that we've come to. And so, anytime I preach, it's an amalgamation of 50 different things, right? But I think the kind of guiding light for me was just how I was feeling during all of the season we've been in, and just so encouraged by his wisdom, maturity, kindness, and thoughtfulness, and directness and kind of I mean, some of the things he says in there, if you don't know the context, you're like, why is he talking about that?
Right.
He's very direct, but it's just, I think that I just would love to be the type of leader that even when I was correcting, you thought he loves me.
Yeah, that's so good.
Yeah.
And not only is that a good answer, but I love the way that you kind of opened up the hood and let us look underneath as to how you prepare, how you approach the study of a book.
Sure.
And I think that's really instructive, not only for somebody who is a teacher, but somebody who is just a person who loves Jesus and wants to know more about the Bible.
Yeah. Right.
So everything is kind of a conglomeration of a bunch of stuff.
It is.
As we talk to people, as we reflect, as we meditate, as we read the Bible, as we read books about the Bible, and even books not about the Bible that speak to us about the Bible.
Yeah, last week George Orwell and
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I love it, man. So that kind of leads me to another question that I wanted to ask you, especially listening to what you had to say this morning. And you made a big deal out of the fact that we not only need intellectual knowledge about the Bible, but we need that experience with God. And I guess my question is this: why do you think it is, as we look at the church today, and you spent, again, you opened your heart and said, man, I'm worried about the church, and here's why.
Yeah.
Why is it, do you think, that we've fallen into this trap in the American church of having this intellectualized approach to Christianity and leaving out the heart? Where's that come from?
Well, in 30 seconds or less.
Yeah, please.
Well, so I don't think that every tribe or denomination does. I think that as the culture has gotten more individualistic, so have our tribes and traditions and denominations, right? That we do what we do. Maybe we don't even remember why we started doing them.
Yeah.
And so there's a lack of interdenominational relationship that is concerning to me, to be honest. So I think that probably the way that I would think about it is there's some, we'll just call them tribes, but throw networks, denoms, all that into that. Some tribes that are heavy intellect and knowledge. I think this church historically would have been that way. Yeah. And then there are other churches that are high experience and almost mysticism, right? And we could throw, and I think these two never shall meet kind of deal. And I think the one uses the other as a negative illustration of why we are what we are. Yeah. So if I'm highly knowledge-based, I look at charismatics and I make a caricature that is not founded in relationship or people, right? And say, see, we don't want to be that. And so I think there's a fear element to it. I think there's a comfort element to it. We just do what we do. We feel like it's right or right enough. Yeah. We don't want to be them. And I think that we a lot of times don't know anybody who has married the two very well, right? I don't know that many people who I think deeply, deeply know theologically, doctrinally, historically, and have had mysterious, supernatural, transcendent experiences. And I would just love for Graceway to be a place where, yes, we have very close-handed, very thoughtful, very historically orthodox, theological premises, practices, beliefs, all of those kind of deals. But I get worried if we only have that and God never shakes the box. Yeah. Because I just see in Scripture that God loves to do that. Like, yes, this is, you're feeling good about it? Yeah, we feel great, God. Yeah, exactly. And I think that when it's always predictable and comfortable, I worry about who's in charge. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a million reasons. I'd be fascinated, especially with your international and missions and all those kind of deals, to hear your perspective on it. But those are a few that come to mind for me. How about for you? Yeah, I think it's great. And as you were going through that, the thing that occurred to me is when you first came, your style is different than mine. Sure. Which is natural. That's why we needed a change. That's why I stepped aside. But I grew up in an era where that emphasis on the intellectual was heavier than it is today. And I think we've gone to another extreme. Agreed. And what I see is God using you to help us find our way back to the true center.
And I'm always thrilled when I hear you preach, because sometimes in the early days people say, well, you gave us all this great cultural and historical context and Pastor Tim was kind of light.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, you don't understand what he goes through.
Sure.
Like you say, I know what's under the hood.
Yeah, right.
And I so respect your theological knowledge and your hard work that comes from studying the scriptures. Like, well, he doesn't go through verse by verse. Like, well, yes, he does sometimes. Yeah. Sometimes he doesn't.
Yeah. Right.
But
right.
I love the fact that you have that balance between the intellectual and the experiential.
Yeah.
And what you said this morning, correct me if I'm wrong, you can't have one without the other.
Can't.
You've got to have them both.
Yeah. Yeah, and towards your, our differing styles, you came from a time and place and a culture, and I did too. But I do want to say part of the reason has nothing to do with, you and I have talked about this, it has nothing to do with what you did or didn't do. But part of the reason that I like to hop into topics and series and ideas and books is around this. This
yes,
is the fundamental
absolutely.
piece, right? Of making sure that we don't just get into, this is just what we do. I don't want to just go 4 weeks,
exactly.
Topical series ad nauseum. And I just always want to try to find new wineskin for us.
Yeah. And we share a love for this church.
Yes.
and a history that is amazing.
Yeah. Yes.
But yet I so appreciate what you just said, because I look back on when I used to sit in your chair.
Yeah.
And some good things happened, for
Yes.
which we're very, very grateful.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I could see some of the brothers and sisters getting a little thick between the ears.
Sure. Yeah.
And, Paul talked to the Corinthians about that knowledge puffs up when you don't have that balanced out with the experience of God's love and love for each other.
Yeah.
And you connected that for us today. So, yeah, thanks for that answer. That's
Right.
that's great. And you asked me about internationally, and I would say, that's one of those basic things that John talked about.
Yes.
That need for both experiential and intellectual, that plays in any culture and any language.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely.
So let me kind of shift gears a little bit if I could, because I keep finding all these things when I listen to you, like, I want to ask him about that. I want to ask about the other. But you talked about this need for this daily confession of sin.
Yeah.
And I was telling you before they turned the cameras on that I was sitting there thinking, I have a condition that I fought twice in my life called cellulitis, which is a very severe infection underneath the skin. And both times I found myself in serious condition in the hospital for 4 or 5 days.
Yeah.
And what I learned from that is that I have to change where I go. I have to wear compression socks every day. I have to put lotion on my feet every day to keep them from cracking, because the infection can come back. I didn't realize the first time I got it, it can reoccur.
Yeah.
Like, it can? So I've had to make changes in my life. Now, what I'm asking you is, how do we apply that same type of daily vigilance? Give me some practical pointers. How would you advise somebody about this confessing sin daily? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's interesting because, I always try to think historically and pastorally through how do we get to a spot that we don't do that, right? And I think back to the kind of tribalism of the church around, that Catholics do that.
Yeah.
Right? Or some group closer to Catholic, Lutheran or Episcopalians, right? And I'm afraid that sometimes in our zeal to not be something else, we lose some of the blessings of other traditions.
Yeah.
So I'm not talking about confession behind a mesh screen. We would say that Jesus is the go-between.
Right.
There doesn't need to be a person, but there is something to. We talked about this a little bit last week. Catechisms, confessions, creeds, all of those kind of deals. That a lot of traditions that are not our tradition, right? We both come from Baptists. We both would consider ourselves
Baptistic. Whatever that means.
Something.
Yeah.
But I think that that hasn't really been a part of our tradition.
Right.
And so I do enjoy. Obviously, I'm not Catholic for a lot of reasons. I'm not high church and some of those, but I do enjoy reading and trying to glean from traditions and spiritual disciplines. Richard Foster comes to mind around how do I, on the regular, take care of my feet. Right?
Yeah.
And you said an interesting thing, like once I understood the necessity, the danger of not doing it, and the blessing of taking care of, the preventative and all those kind of things, I just naturally changed my behavior around those things.
Yeah.
And so I think that what I was trying to say today is sin is way more damaging than you think it is.
Yeah.
And the prescription that God gives us is way simpler. And I think it's important for us to note the preventative,
Yeah.
to note the blessing of what God keeps us from, when we're closer to our sinfulness and the gospel, and figure out a way to, I have different things that I read every single day, different things that I pray every single day, just because I don't want the infection to come back.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
And
that's that sin in us.
Yeah. And so I think we don't, just because it's not a part of our family tree.
Right.
And because we don't really understand both the damage of sin and the blessing of confession.
Well, even like you just said, people sometimes don't read history.
Yeah.
And if you go back far enough in history, there was a day when Baptists had confessions.
Agreed. That's right.
And creeds.
That's right.
And
That's
things
right.
like that. But we, like you say, we develop our little tribes, and then we forget that
We do.
we have more in common than we're
we do.
divided about.
We do.
So let me drop another question on you, and we'll probably wrap up with this, because this really reached out and grabbed me today when you said both sin and holiness are contagious.
Yeah.
I love that expression. Unpack that for me a little bit. What do you mean by that?
Well, so John, I said some of this from the stage. John is talking about confessing our sins, and God's faithful and just to forgive us our sins. And, we learn that in Bible school, kind of to memorize that. But I always think about confession as in the present addressing something in the past. So John comes along and he says, hey, y'all, I'm writing this to you so that you don't sin. And the nod is to the future. And I was really kind of flummoxed by that, because how can I go back and not sin in the past? And then God was kind of like, he's not talking about the past. He's talking about the posture that prevents things in the future.
And thank you for going there, because that's what grabbed me. Is this is not dealing with sin that is past. It's a future look. So let me tell something that happened to me 2 days ago.
Okay.
And see if you can make application. I'm coming back from Dallas on a plane.
Right.
I'm sitting there, and a guy comes to sit next to me. Well, first of all, I'm not sure it's a guy.
Okay.
A figure comes down the aisle with a hoodie on that's all closed up, and a mask that is almost like an Islamic woman would wear. And comes and sits down beside me. I'm not sure whether it's a male or a female to begin with.
Sure.
And the person is looking out the window the whole time. Eventually turns back, and I can see that the hoodie is up, double mask, and just it was a guy. But I'm thinking, wow, he's really serious about this thing. So he's worried because we have this Delta variant out there that is extremely contagious. Now, if holiness is just as contagious as sin, doesn't that speak to what you started with today, where you're talking about, I'm worried about the church, why are we so divided, why are we this or that?
It does.
I just imagine a world where holiness was that contagious.
Thank you for the setup. That was excellent.
I just passed it to you. Falls in your court. I always, we want to be spiritually minded, and you think about the points of attack that the enemy uses, and it's very easy to see culturally and in the church how the idea of holiness as prudish and sinfulness, sin as light, in terms of license, and just how easily those fences get moved for us, and we don't even really know what we're doing or what's being done to us. So I think it's really as simple as, when I commit myself to holiness at the macro, it has an effect in the daily. And when I don't, when I think it's not that big of a deal, sin's not that big of a deal, or sin's inevitable, or I don't want to be old-fashioned, things happen in my mind, in my beliefs, in how I view the world, in my soul, in my practices. And I think that when I commit today, I'm going to pursue holiness, and I'm going to confess sin. I think it not only addresses the past, because the gospel covers it, addresses today, but I think it sets my posture, sets my face toward tomorrow.
And I think,
but it's also contagious.
Yeah.
And it affects the people around us.
Affects the people around us. Yeah. Yeah. You know, when you're, you know, I know about you that you are somebody who takes holiness seriously. And you take liberty seriously too. And all, but there are certain conversations I'm never going to have with you. Certain things we're never going to do together, right? Certain things that just predict what our relationship is and isn't going to be about. And you know, I think that's God's wisdom in Proverbs of, you know, basically saying make sure you're careful about who your friends are, because you know your liberty, license, sinfulness rubs off on me, and I think we've all experienced that, in some way, shape, or form. So
absolutely, wow. Yeah. So what can we look forward to next week? Where are we headed?
So next week we are headed to John, talking about kind of the freedom that we have to obey. It's a very
the freedom
boring,
to obey.
Yeah,
I love that.
Freedom to obey.
Start.
And you know, for anybody, I just would encourage people just be reading through 1 John, just kind of let it soak in, and then we'll kind of see where God takes us.
I talked to a young lady this morning in the lobby, and she was asking me a question about, I've been reading through 1 John,
That's
like
awesome.
what Pastor Tim told us to do.
That's awesome.
Thank you for that.
That's awesome. Very cool.
All right. Well, I'll look forward to seeing that. And thank you for joining us. And we hope that you'll come back, and we're just going to talk.
That's right.
Thanks for tuning into the Graceway Experience. Hope we can talk again sometime.